So I'll keep my comments very short. We've had a very nice write-up about Ajay, and he is just an amazing guy. So even in the Silicon Valley, it's rare to see a person that has done 4 startups in 15 years, and this is one of those guys. So not only is still looking very young, I don't really know how old you are, Ajay, but is handsome, looking young, and doing great stuff, and this is just probably the 5th gig he's going to talk about today. But anyway, without much ado, I'm going to bring him on board, and after he finishes speaking, we're going to have a Q&A, so please, we got carve out half an hour for that, okay? So looking forward to that. Ajay, without much ado, please come on.
Thank you, and let's get started. So before I start, I really want to thank the Thai organizers. I'm going to start with Ram and Venk and Saurabh and everyone else, who did a great job in putting this forum together. But I cannot forget Kanwal Rekhi, he was sitting right there. And there's a story I was sharing with him, and he remembered that. About 25 years back, when I didn't know Kanwal from Adam, and he didn't know who I was, and he probably doesn't even know who I am even today. And I was unmarried at that point in time. I was working for a company in Milpitas, and I used to hit a Chinese restaurant, and he used to hit a Chinese restaurant. And he recently sold, at that point in time, I think you sold your company to Novell, and he was the CTO of Novell. And he would eat green beans all by himself, sitting on a table, and it probably still does, in a Chinese restaurant. And I would go and order the same thing. I would sit in, a couple tables ahead, somewhere near vicinity. And one of these, lunches, he invited me to his table. He said, hey, I've been seeing you eating all by yourself, the same thing that I eat, right? So why don't you come and sit with me? And we started having conversation. I didn't even, at that point in time, I didn't even know who he was. And we would meet, occasionally once a week or twice a week, and he would inspire me. But that's all I remember, right? And after he started ThighCon, that was the first time I met him and said, holy cow, man, I was having, daily lunches with him. And he was the CTO of Novell at that point in time, the greatest the company in that genre. But anyways, thank you so much for coming in. My goal is to make this thing very interactive, and whatever I've learned in the last 15 years, I thought that I will not put a PowerPoint presentation, but I'll just speak to my heart. And my real, desire is to inspire the entrepreneurs who are actually either launching a company or have already launched a company and are looking for ways to proceed further, right? So that's the whole point of my, my speech today. In any given entrepreneur's career, there are 3 stages that I can think of, or at least I've gone through. Stage number 1 is, when you're an employee, in a company and you want to become an entrepreneur. You have a lot of ideas in your mind, but you're hesitant to take that step, right? You're there, but you cannot jump into the entrepreneurship. There's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of fear factor, there's a lot of anxiety in yourself, and you're stuck there. And I know a lot of people. I know 80 or 90% of those people who are just stuck there, right? But they have great ideas over there, but they cannot make a jump. So what I'll talk about is there are certain things that I learned in my career. There are certain ingredients that you have to have in order to, cross that kind of chasm. The second stage comes in where, you've successfully launched a startup, and in the first couple of years, 2-3 years, very important. I would say important in terms of from 0 to, say, $3 million, $5 million worth of revenue, because that's the foundation years. That are the years where if you cannot scale up to that level, then you're dead, right? And 1 out of 10 startups succeed. If you're not in that 1 out of that 10 startup, maybe it's 1 out of 15 startups that succeed, in the end. If you're not in one of those, then you're just wasting your time. So, and the third stage comes in is, after a successful exit. We all have, at least, people in the front row have had successful exit. And so I'm not going to spend time on there because, what you do after that is you sit in the front rows and, people like Kanwal sit in the second row and you inspire people, right? So, you know exactly what you need, what you do after that, right? So let's go back to, the stage 1, the jump from entrepreneurship from being an employee. And there's a lot of confusion during that time period. And I made some cheat sheet for myself so that I don't miss out on certain kinds of points. But there are 2 or 3 things that I really want to highlight, in order to inspire all of you, right? And if you guys have, more to add, please raise your hand, because it's supposed to be an interactive forum. I don't have anything to present, and we'll share. I'm here as much as, you guys are in terms of learning the whole thing about. So the first point I have is the right thinking. Your thinking have to change, when you are starting a company, or when you want to become an entrepreneur from an employee. Most of the time, at least if I look into myself, 15 years back, you're so much in your daily rut, right? You're stuck in your daily rut, your family life, your business life, your kids' life, your social life, all kinds of life, that your thinking process is just stuck where they were, 15 years back, or 10 years back, or even last week, or even, 3 months back, right? You're not evolving, right? And your thinking process is the same today, and your thinking process will be the same, 2 months down the road, right? So where is the room for innovation? Because you're so stuck right there. And so, I was exactly in that spot. I was stuck in my thinking process. And one fine morning, maybe it's Kanwal who did that, in the lunches that he used to have with me. But, you got to change your thinking process. You got to introduce innovation in your thinking process. You got to be progressive in your thinking. And if you're not progressive in your thinking, you can never do a startup, right? I mean, that's the bottom line for, me to jump into the entrepreneurship. Many, if you look into, the process, at least I've seen myself, right? Many times you just get stuck in your thinking process and you cannot evolve further, right? At that point in time, you probably read a book, or you probably talk to somebody who's very inspirational, and you certainly get a jump, to go ahead from your thinking process, which is stuck in the cesspool of status quo. Many of the great leaders of today, if you look into successful entrepreneurs, like, in the Valley, today or yesteryears as well, in the Valley you look into Elon Musk, you look into Google founders, you look into Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, or even yesteryears, look into late Steve Jobs, or even Wright brothers, more than a century back, who remembers Wright brothers, right? People who invented airplanes, right? The tectonic shift in the economy that they created because of their inventions. You remember Walt Disney, right? Even today, you remember folks like Sam Malone and Rupert Murdoch and media industry. They all changed certain kinds of things. Even social entrepreneurs, right? You talk about Mahatma Gandhi, right? You talk about Martin Luther King. Millions and millions of lives were positively impacted by those guys. But what is one thing that they all do, similarly, and which most of us, we don't? What's that? They all think, they all act, and they all communicate in a similar fashion, and most of us, we don't, right? And that's the very essence of entrepreneurship, right? We go out there, our thinking are jaded, right? Our thinking is stuck in that cesspool of status quo. And when these guys come out there, they're trained, their mindset is trained to become more progressive in thinking. They're talking about innovation. They're really talking about how do you, detect a problem, and then how do you solve the problem. Their mindset is solving the problems every single time. And until you have that kind of a mindset on a daily basis, you're thinking out loud and you're solving things out, I don't think so you can become a very successful startup person, right? So that is one of the things that, I would highly recommend, that when you are making a jump from an employee to entrepreneurship, or becoming an entrepreneur, try to mend your thinking. Try to consciously go into your thinking process and catapult yourself out of the status quo, because status quo is just, gonna not lead you to anywhere else, right? And most of these guys, they are progressive, they're problem solvers, and they create solutions which are better, cheaper, faster, right? You put them into any solution, into any environment out there, and they're good at that. And secondly, they're not thinking about themselves. You should never think about yourself when you're thinking of a startup. You think about environment. You think about macroeconomic issues or macro issues out there. And that's where the disruption really needs to happen. And disruption can only happen if you have a positive thinking, if you have a right thinking. if you look into, and then you have to have a passion, right? You have to have a really good passion to do something, money is not a motivator factor. It should not be a motivator factor to start a startup, right? It should be a passion that you're really following through. And if you're truly, genuinely following a passion, you will find, things started to line up for yourself, right? Look at the Wright brothers. I remember reading an article on these guys, and, when they were in early, I think it was 1800 some years, people were really calling them clowns. And people thought that, nobody can fly. And, they were ridiculed in every single party they would go, right? But they stuck to it because they were passionate about that. And they discovered this 3-axle control, which would enable an aircraft to, perfectly steer themselves into the midair and create a perfect equilibrium. Even today, they're using that kind of a technology, right? But that is the passion, and that's the tectonic shift. The airlines industry took place and, created trillions and trillions of dollars worth of ancillary airlines, right? It's all about thinking. It's all about the passion that you induce in your thought process. The other thing, which is very important, when you are thinking of taking a jump from an employee to an entrepreneur, is to audit yourself, right? Many people don't audit themselves and they just jump into it and they then figure it out, who they are. You've got to be brutally honest to understand what is your USP, what do you bring to the table, right? You cannot teach entrepreneurship anywhere. No college can really make you an entrepreneur. It's really within. And unless and until you are, absolutely brutally honest to yourself, you cannot become a successful entrepreneur because you need to find a seat at the table. You need to be at the right seating. If you're a great technologist, if you're a great, architecture guy, you don't aspire to be a CEO. A CEO is not a major deal, and vice versa. If you can inspire, people, if you can lead people, if you can, think through, things, you're a visionary, then don't try to become a VP of engineering because it's going to be a disaster. Right? So it's very important to really understand who you are, what's your USP, and don't try to fit the, what do you call that, the square peg into the round hole, right? Because in the end, if you're not honest to yourself, it'll come back and bite you, right? And it has happened many times. In our company, Quantum, when we first got started, and I'm fortunate enough that Vic and Sean, Vic is my CTO and Sean is my VP of engineering out there, we all sat down together. And they decided that the most incompetent person out of the three will become the CEO, and they chose me, right? So, this happens, and I thank them for that. But that's the case, right? You got to get rid of your ego. You got to be understanding where you really fit into the picture. And once you understand, once you have evolved your thinking, and once you know who you are, you can really get into the startup side of the house. There's a third part that I really want to emphasize on the startup piece of it is, how do you find the idea? Right? Now you've evolved thinking, you're really thinking through innovation, you're really disrupting, you're really eager to disrupt. How do you find an idea? And I go back to a famous quote from Albert Einstein, and Einstein said, the problems that we face today cannot be solved with the same level of thinking used when we first created those problems, right? It's a very powerful statement. And every day, if you just repeat it once, you would really understand what Einstein is trying to say. You cannot solve the problems with the same level of thinking used when you first created the problem, which means your thinking is the most important ingredient to propel you to become an entrepreneur, to really start some kind of an innovative idea, to really sustain some kind of an innovative idea, right? And when I look into the most important thing, how do you start the idea, is that thinking process, right? So you challenge the status quo, right? You have to, be smart enough to challenge your status quo and disrupt or introduce some kind of a disruption in that status quo to innovate into the future. And many times, the problems that you're experiencing in everyday life, become, or problems that you see other people experiencing in everyday life becomes a stepping stone towards innovation and entrepreneurship, right? And this has happened, to everyone. Richard Branson, he used to run a records company before he started Virgin Atlantic. But he used to travel like a madman everywhere. He used to take all kinds of airlines, and his experience was absolutely pathetic. And because of that, pain that he suffered, he started one of the fantastic airlines that, disrupted the process at that point in time. And we've seen Uber doing the same thing out there. Facebook got started, as a yearbook for Harvard, right? And because he saw a problem over there, because the printed copies would get lost, so he saw certain kinds of status quo, in the process, and he injected his thinking, and he injected in the entrepreneurship innovation into it, and created a Facebook, and it started, developing from there. I'll tell you a story about quantum and how we got started with our idea. It so happened that when I exited out of my last company, and we sold it to a small publicly traded company here in Fremont, and we had some golden handcuffs, and we were resting out there. My partner, Vic, was with me at that point in time. And one day he came to my office and he said that, Ajay, let's go to Florida. I said, why? And he said, well, there's a company called Tyco. That's the first time I heard a company by the name Tyco. Is a $20 billion company. I later on, realized. But there's a company called Tyco, and they invited us, to attend their very exclusive symposium, which they only open it up for their consultants and their choicest customers out there, only 300 people. And we were fortunate enough that they invited us to be there. I said, well, I don't want to go, it's physical security, I don't understand physical security. He said, no, let's go. And the best of all is they're paying for the food, they're paying for the room, and everything. You just have to pay for the airlines. And I said, okay. If that's the case, we'll go. And it was in Key Biscayne. So it was like, hey, it's a fantastic 3 days vacation. Let's just do it, right? So we went there, right? And we sat down 3 days, and it was one of the White House person was a keynote speaker there. One of the high-up White House speaker was there. So, it was all good package for a very little price. And we went there. And we started mingling with the customers and the consultants over there. And we started and these guys were all stuck in 1980s and 90s, right? They were all talking about, access management, access controls, intrusion detection, data breaches in their physical environment, all kinds of stuff that we, from Vic and I perspective, we came from the IT world. We really understood all of those kinds of things. So we started understanding the pain points that they were talking. Many of the times they didn't even realize that was a pain. They were just talking as a status quo. And we came back and we started, working on a business plan. In 6 months, we said that this is the company we're going to launch, and we're going to be in identity and access management for physical security. Right? It was that simple. But the only reason we get to that point was because we went out there. And we started mingling, and we started seeing something which our thinking process, which was more disruptive in nature, how do you disrupt your status quo, helped us find that particular idea. There's a couple other things that I want to, share with you guys. The ideas that spread wins. That's another notion that I heard, which means that if you're thinking of doing a startup, right? If you're thinking of doing an idea which is only going to help your neighborhood, right? I would say don't pursue that. But if you have an idea that can impact millions of lives out there, then definitely pursue that, because that's the idea. If you can spread the idea. Example, when the sliced bread, which is just a slice of a bread, was invented, for the first 10 to 15 years, it failed. It failed to catch on as anything, right? Nobody actually recognized sliced bread. Nobody even cared about sliced bread until Wonder Bread came into the picture. And Wonder Bread actually took that sliced bread concept and made it popularized globally. And it became sensational. And in fact, even today, we talk about sliced bread in our colloquial speeches, right? It's better than sliced bread, or next thing to sliced bread, right? It's because of the Wonder Bread that happened. There's another story that I wanted to share. The other day I was talking to my father, and my father was, he's a retired bureaucrat from India, and he retired at the age of 58 years because that was a retirement age at that point in time. So I asked him, Dad, why? You're so energetic. Why did you retire? Why did Indian government made you retire at 58? He said, well, after the India got independence in 1947, in 1950s, the average age in India was just mid-30s. And I said, impossible. I said, it's impossible to believe, right? He said, yeah, it was mid-30s, and that was the reason why the Indian government had the 58 as a retirement age, right? So I Googled it, and you guys all feel free to Google it, and it was the case. In 1950s, the average age in India was 35 years because they take mortality, the child mortality into the mix as well. But there was lack of healthcare and biotech and all that stuff. And then I compared that with China. China was upper 30s, right? Very close to 40s. And US was 60, right? And today, in 2015, today, that has gone up to, Indian average age has gone up to about 60. China, or mid-60s. China has gone to almost close to 70, and US is about 82. And if you look into the prediction in the next 20 years, that average age is even further increasing by 10 to 15%. What does this tell you? It just tells you that, the people are living longer. And if you guys are all entrepreneurs out here, with the raise of hand, who has started a company, who wants to start a company, or has thought of starting a company and dropped the idea? Fantastic. And there's many more who are not raising their hands, I know. But that's okay, right? But definitely the reason I'm telling you this thing is because this is a bigger trend. This is a trend that as an entrepreneur you've got to understand and recognize, because you want to start something, that can stick forever, right? And this is the trend where there is an aging population out there, and these are consumptive population. These are the people who have money and who are going to consume. So you can build products and services to cater to these guys, and it'll stick, right? Another example I wanted to share with you guys is Amazon.com. They just recently, about 2 months back, they did Amazon Prime Day. Who remembers that? What was so unique about Amazon Prime Day? Anybody? Anything special that anybody noticed? No, it was a free shipping, but the biggest thing to notice in that was it was bigger than Black Friday. Okay? Now think about it, right? Black Friday was invented in 1960s, right? It's household names. Everybody knows about Black Friday. Amazon Prime Day started 5-6 years back, and it dwarfed Black Friday, which was almost about 70 years of brand, in 5 years. What does this tell you? It tells you that the old economy, or the new economy, is taking over the old economy, right? And it also tells you that the historical relationship between the economic factors and the consumption is no longer valid, right? So you cannot really apply the thinking that you have had in 1980s and 1990s to today's problem, right? So going back to my first point, your thinking has to evolve, and it has to evolve continuously. And if you put the same level of thinking that you were thinking, 20 years back, you're bound to fail. You're in that statistics of 9 out of 10 companies fail. The reason why that 9 out of 10 companies fail is because you're not thinking through properly, right? That's the biggest, lesson learned. And, another thing, right? If you look into Google, for instance, I think Google would be the first company in our lifetime which will become $70 to $100 billion in revenue with zero inventory. Can you believe it? 50 years back, it would be very tough to make anybody believe that any company would reach $70 to $100 billion in revenue with zero inventory. So things are changing, right? These are all tectonic shifts which are happening, and we've got to embrace those. And successful entrepreneurs are the entrepreneurs who actually recognize that and then take certain kinds of action to launch a company in those trends and make money out of that. Making money is secondary, though. It's a passion that is primary. Money will follow you if you make money. And the last thing that I have is in the first phase, which is when you're becoming an entrepreneur from an employee, is you've got to have dramatic amount of belief and trust in yourself, right? And if you don't have dramatic amount of belief and trust in yourself, then you are wavering, you're shaking all the time. Steve Jobs did a fantastic job in his speech in Stanford University, a few years back, and I think most of you have seen it on, YouTube or something like that. And I encourage if you have not. But he said it very, very clearly that dots will connect in the end if you believe in yourself, right? And when you are doing a startup, right? There are all kinds of FUD factor, right? It's a fear, uncertainty, doubt, and all those kinds of things. And you're laying those dots out as you're building, your company. But if you have a tremendous amount of belief and trust in yourself that these dots will ultimately connect, I guarantee you that these dots will ultimately connect, right? But you have to have that kind of a passion and a belief from your heart that these dots will connect. So these are the 4 things that I think, when I was thinking this morning that what would I speak, these are the 4 things that stood out in my mind in terms of most important ingredients towards becoming from an employee to entrepreneur. And if you do these kinds of 4 things yourself and you have this kind of things ingrained in your head, I can almost guarantee you that you're 50% there in terms of success, right? The other phase, and if you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt me. The other phase, the second phase was, after you've fixed your thinking, you've audited yourself, you know your USP, who you are, you've found a great business idea and you have perfect belief in yourself. Now you launch a company, right? You have a great idea, you're progressive thinking, now you launch the company. Then what do you do in that? So I always advise my, whoever is entrepreneur is, first of all, the initial team is very, very important, right? And you've got to pick the right team members. You've got to have a trust, amongst the team members. You have to have just like I just cannot say it. Maybe Vic and Sean can tell me what to say about that. You've got to have that, feeling, in the initial team members, of connection, in the similar push that everyone is pushing in the similar direction, that passion. Everyone has to have a similar kind of passion to succeed. And if one of the guys or two, or the team does not have that kind of trust and the passion and the belief built in, I think, that's a recipe for disaster. So, choosing your initial team is very important. And also, the team has to be diverse. The other day, somebody came for an advice, and I met with those guys, and there were 7 of them. And they were saying, well, hey, we're launching a company, and we have this idea, and all of those kinds of stuff. And they're all great people, because they'll be probably listening to this thing. They're all great people. But they said, well, they were not clear who's going to do what, right? People were saying, I'm going to do architecture, I'm going to do VP of engineering and all that stuff, right? And then the smartest guy out of those 7 people said, well, we're actually looking for a VP of engineering, and down the road we'll look for a CEO. So there are 9 people already, right, in a startup. Right? How can you start a startup, when your initial team is so messy, right? You can't do that. So it's very important to have that initial team, ingrained. Secondly, I want the founders, to put some skin in the game, right? Many times the founders don't put skin in the game. They don't, and skin in the game is not just your time. I think it's financial commitment, right? You've got to put some kind of financial commitment, because, when everything is great, it's hunky-dory, right? Everything is going, positively for you. But when the disaster comes, when the crisis comes, that's the time you don't want the founders to, to bolt out, right? And if you have a financially committed founder, he's not going to bolt out. He's going to do whatever it takes to make the concern successful. Now, these are important things I'm mentioning, because these are important to become successful in the end, right? Why 9 out of 10 companies fail is because they fail to put these kinds of things in their mindset when they start a company. So it's very important to, have skin in the game. Secondly, when you start a company, you've got to have a, legal representation right. Even smaller things like, 83B filing, some of you might know what that is. But these are important things, in order for you to become or reap the benefits down the road. You've got to have proper accounting out there. You start auditing yourself, from day one. It's very important when a VC puts money in. It's very important when you exit. There's an M&A out there. Although it seems like, overkill in the initial stages, but it really tremendously, in all my companies, it really helped, down the road. Our M&A process was very, very smooth because of these kinds of audits out there. Then you raise some capital, people really bog down about the valuation, and how much money will I get it, and all those kinds of things. And I would say, and there's a great session, I think next week or somewhere about Naeem Zafar. He's going to talk about, how do you become from a founder to a CEO, and a lot of things and he's a great speaker, by the way. He's a mesmerizing speaker, so I encourage all of you to attend that session. But, he really would talk about things like, what are the valuation mix? How do you become, from a founder to a CEO? What are the roles and responsibilities, at that point in time? The other thing in this category, I would say, is become extremely capital efficient, because that's, first of all, you have a commitment to yourself to become successful, but you're also raising some money from your VCs and other stakeholders. You want to make sure that they make money as well. We built, believe it or not, this fantastic enterprise software company with $4.5 million. And whoever I tell this story, in the Valley, everybody, they don't believe in me, right? Especially the VCs don't believe in me. But our VCs really lucked out, because we came back. I mean, we all 3 of us We sat down and we said that we're not going to raise another round of funding unless until we are forced to do that, right? And we started India operation from day one. The day we launched the company, within that month, we hired our first employee in India, right? And we started that operation in India. And the reason, people in India are phenomenal, by the way. I mean, we wouldn't have done anything, we wouldn't have reached to this stage if we didn't have India connection. By the way, all of you are Indian, so good applause for yourself. But yeah, we started that operation. We were very, very thankful, for the thinking process that we had at that point in time and the growth we experienced. The other thing I wanted to bring out is when you launch a company, you are guaranteed to make mistakes, right? I mean, don't be afraid of making mistakes and taking decisions. Everything is new for you. The market is new, the product is new. Many of the team members alongside with you are new. You have, the customers that you're aspiring to get are new. I mean, there are a lot of new things. And if you don't make a mistake, then you're not a true entrepreneur, right? You're doing something else, right? So you're bound to make a mistake. But there's silver lining in making a mistake. First of all, you take decisions, right? Many times I've seen people just stuck in the analysis paralysis mode. They would not move out. They will just, shrug taking some kind of a hard decision, right? And, things move on. But when you take right decisions, many times it becomes successful, and many times it's just, make mistakes out of this thing, but you move on. And when you make mistakes, mistakes will lead you to disappointment. But if you are in a progressive thinking mode, then you can take that disappointment and you start thinking and put your strategy hat on it, come up with a new strategy, which leads to your innovation. So in either cases, right, whether you take a decision and it's right, you're great. If you made a mistake, you have a chance to correct it and move forward with it. So never be afraid on taking decision and making mistakes in the startup. The other thing which is also very important, which is I think the most important after you start, is the early customer wins. And I think that is something where I would spend a little bit more of my time to really make you guys understand. I mean, that's where the rubber meets the road, right? You've done everything. You have positive thinking, you have a great team, you have a successful idea. But if nobody's buying your idea, if nobody's willing to pay money for that, then you have not really done anything, significant, right? So the early customer wins, are extremely important. I remember, I'll tell you a story of Quantum. And one of the ways you can do the early customer wins is to spread your ideas. When you launch it, go to attend as many meetings as possible. Try to be on the cover or in a magazine article. Try to spread your word because, somebody is going to read about that kind of a thing. It's not to glorify yourself, by the way. Don't ever think of, glorifying yourself, in a cover or a magazine. But you want to put your value proposition out. I mean, that's the most important part of it, right? I'll tell you a story about Quantum. We were in a stealth mode, and we would take a chance to, socialize our value proposition to the relevant audience, We used to have a consultant in the Bay Area, a security consultant in the Bay Area, who would run General Electric's user group. And GE was, I think they have about $8 or $10 billion, security business in the physical side of the house that they eventually sold out to UTC. But at that point in time, this consultant would run the users group in the Bay Area. And in one of our meetings, he agreed to bring us in to the users group. And he said that, well, our policy is to not bring any vendors. But you guys are not technically a vendor because you don't even have a product. So, we'll bring you guys in and you share your concept, and you inspire the people out there. And we said, yeah, we'll come, right? And we jumped on it and we came over there. But he had a condition. His condition was, when you walk in, I'm going to dim the lights. You're not allowed to talk to anybody over there. You are going to we're going to give you 30 minutes, so you be prepared with your PowerPoint presentation. You just do your presentation. You're not allowed to talk to anybody, and then you get out. I said, we'll take it, right? So both Vic and I went to this users group, and we started presenting, right? 3/4 of a way in, there was one hand that went up, and the guy started asking us a question and all that stuff, and he was a senior director at a company called Symantec for security. And then he stood up, he flipped the lights on, and he said, well, I want to engage in discussion, right? And he's a very intelligent, man out there. Started asking questions, and we were there for about 45 minutes till we were thrown out, along with him to the hallway, and said that, well, take your discussions out, and we have other agendas to, fulfill. But when we were out there in the hallway, we started talking, and he said, when can you come to our office? And we said, tomorrow morning at 10. And so both of us, he said, agreed. So we both went there at 10 o'clock the next day, and we got out of his office maybe at about 3 or 4 in the evening, right, about 4 or 5 hours. And the whole night before that, we prepared a clear PowerPoint presentation, right? But in his office the next day, we whiteboarded our, solution. How's the access intrusion happens? What are the things that we're going to do? What is IDS? What are data breaches and physical security? We talked about, everything over there, and we whiteboarded our solution, right? And outcome of that, 4 or 5 hours, of his office was a $25,000 check for a pilot that he wanted to do in 3 months. Look at that, right? That changed everything. That increased our valuation, that gave us confidence that here's the customer, who's willing to pay some money from what we are thinking and dreaming so far. And not only that, the problem was real. It got validated by Symantec, right? The biggest security company in the world, right? So we were very lucky in that thing. But if we had declined, to not go and participate in that, then we would have lost this opportunity. Maybe we would have been in this different criteria, right? Different place out there. So it's always important to go out there and try to, get socializing your concept, at any given opportunity. The other thing, and also you've got to have a risk appetite, for yourself, right? And if depending upon the risk appetite you have, you're going to act and operate in a very different way. And we had a pretty high level of risk appetite just because we've been natural entrepreneurs, I can say that. But I'll tell you another story about the risk appetite. And in this story, you will learn that the customer is not always right? And it so happened, there was the largest telecom company who was sort of interested in our concept and a solution. This was after we had 2 or 3 customers already. And we were taken to that largest telecom company, in Dallas by a partner of ours. And we went there and we presented our story. Right? And, there was all kinds of people, a few VPs out there, and they all listened very intently, and they clapped, and they really liked it. And after about 4 hours or 3 hours, the senior VP out there made a statement, oh, great, I think we really love your technology, and we were kicking back ourselves. He's saying, wow, fantastic. But then he said, but really it's not meant for AT&T. It's not meant for that large telecom company. It's not meant for that large telecom company because, our processes are so complicated. What you guys are doing is great concept, but our processes are so complicated that you really cannot get into that. You cannot really understand that. You cannot really solve our data breaches. If you're failing audit and compliance, you cannot really help us out. So, we have a staff of 30 people, and we're going to train them, and they're going to just take care of that. And they said, thank you very much. And we were very disappointed because, everything went on like a clockwork, right? Everything was very, very fine, but we were very disappointed. So we went back, right? But we didn't give up, right? We, in about 2 months of time, I visited them 4 times, right? And they kept on, saying, no, it's great. Yeah, maybe we'll do it next year. Maybe we'll do this. Maybe we'll do. So 5th time we went there with a different strategy. And the 5th time we went there, we said, guys, look, you like our technology? Yes, we do. But you're not ready to pick up our technology because you don't believe that it'll solve your problem. I said, yeah, that's very right. And you don't want to disrupt your status quo. That's very right. I said, well, and they also said that we don't want to spend millions of dollars, just on, what you guys are thinking that it's going to work because we know that it's not going to work. I said, that's fine. So what we did was we gave them an offer that they couldn't refuse. We said that, okay, don't pay us any money. We don't want any single money from you guys. But you have 30 people, working on your staff to manage this problem in US, right? It's very highly paid people. It is, it costs money. But if we bring our technology in and we deploy it on our own dime and we start to displace your people, would you give us 85% of their salary to us on a regular basis? But they all looked into each other and said, yeah, we have nothing to lose. We're going to make 15%, we'll part with 85%. Oh, by the way, we're going to say that, we're going to do, many, other business processes optimization that they didn't have it, right? They all agreed to it. Next week, we drafted, a contract, and we all signed on it. And then we sat down in our team and said, oh, shit, because we were a startup company. We just raised $4.5 million. It was also dwindling down. But it was a major customer, and we didn't want to raise. I mean, if we could have raised, umpteen amount of money. There's a lot of money sitting in the sidelines everywhere, right? But we consciously said that we were not going to raise any more money. So we sat down and we started delivering, slowly the solution set to those guys. Today, they represent the largest customer we have. They're extremely satisfied. They're very, very referenceable. And we have not just that telecom company. We have Comcast, we have Verizon, we have Oi Telecom, we have British Telecom, all kinds of companies because of that plug that we got in, right? The point being is when you are at that stage, early wins, can take you to places. Early customer wins can take you to places. The only thing I have is now almost at the concluding remark, So now you've fixed your thinking process all the way to starting a company. And when you start your company, you have certain things that you want to do, including the early wins of the customer. That's where the rubber meets the road. And in concluding my talk, I would just say that, guys, dreams are not limited. You have a birthright to the dreams. If you fix your thinking process, you can do anything that you want. You just have to step out of your comfort zone. You just have to challenge yourselves to be not in the muck and the cesspool of the status quo of your thinking. Start to put some disruption out there. Be brutally honest to what you bring to the table. And really, you can become a very successful entrepreneur. That's all I have for tonight.
What an absolutely fantastic evening. Thank you, Ajay, for coming and
thank you very
sharing
much.
your wisdom with us.